So we'll continue with Samson next week. We'll discuss his lady problems and his role in the book of Judges as a whole. But to make sense of Samson's role in this book and in Israelite history in general, you'll need to know what follows after Samson. So please read the last two stories in Judges, which is Judges 17 through 21, and then the first section of Samuel, which is 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 8. It'll take you from Samuel's birth to the coronation of Saul, King Saul, the establishment of the monarchy. Now, as you read, do yourself a favor and don't try to understand the two bizarre stories at the end of the book of Judges. Okay? The story of Micah's statue and the outrage of Giv'ah, the Levites' concubine in Giv'ah. Better commentators than you and me have tried, and I don't think with much success, to explain or understand these stories. Some adherents of the biblical criticism, for example, claim that this whole story, or these later stories in the last two stories of Judges, are a later insertion. That it's a fantasy masquerading as history, whose purpose was to slyly denigrate Saul's tribe, his hometown, and his family in context of the ongoing campaign by David against the remnants of Saul's line. Okay, that's something that comes from the days of King David and inserted into the later into the book of Judges as denigrating stories about Saul's tribe and hometown, etc. Now, this kind of speculation includes many additional and unspoken speculations about the author or the editors and the audience of the book of Judges. So it's all highly speculative. What I want you to see, so again, just I wouldn't try to understand too deeply, because it is really, you can get lost in it. I get lost in it. What I do want you to see in these stories, in the last two stories in Judges, is the fact that the tribes suddenly, at the end of the book of Judges, come together for a major and successful war against the common enemy. In this case, a civil war against Benjamin, against the tribe of Benjamin. Something that we do not see throughout the book of Judges, but we see regularly in the next book, in Samuel, as the Israelites unite to confront their various common enemies. Under Samuel, and then under Kings Saul and David, the Jews will liberate themselves from will again come together for major wars and liberate themselves from their neighbors and finally establish full control over the land of Israel. So that's the message about those two stories. But I do, however, want to give context to the carving of the Levites' concubine following the outrage at Giv'ah, carving her into 12 pieces and sending them to the 12 tribes. In those days, sending pieces of a slaughtered animal, not a person like here, but a slaughtered animal, to your various allies was a common ceremonial way to call on allies to join you in battle. And you can see an example of this when King Saul, in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 7, does exactly this. Okay, he uses an ox, not a person, of course, but he does this. He carves it into 12 pieces, and he sends it to the 12 tribes to call on them to join him for war against the Ammonites. Okay, so he does this, and the 12 tribes clearly knew and understood the messaging technique, because when they received these pieces, these chunks of meat, they responded as Saul had hoped, and they show up en masse to fight for Saul. Now, this ceremonial custom of how to call allies to war paralleled the ceremony of signing an alliance, because the alliance ceremony also involved slaughtering an animal, cutting it into pieces, and then sacrificing them to the gods, or in our case, to God. Okay, and you can see an example of this in Abraham's covenant of the pieces with God, which we discussed a long time ago. That by cutting animals apart and sacrificing them, the allies were swearing a religious oath, effectively saying, let this be done to me if I break the terms of this covenant. May I be separated, killed and separated, if I break this agreement, this alliance. Okay, so sending pieces of a sacrificial animal to allies reminds them of their oath. Okay? And it is also an implied threat, okay? Just like with the alliance itself. Be warned that this will be your fate. This slaughtered animal, this chunk of meat, this will be your fate if you don't step up and join your ally as promised. Okay? And indeed, when King Saul does it in Samuel, in chapter 11, verse 7, each piece is sent to a different territory with a warning. Quote, whoever does not come forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. After which it says that the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out as one man. Okay, so the anthropological reasoning behind this ceremony, we see the biblical author tells us worked as intended. Now, even without understanding the details and meaning and purpose of the two final stories in Judges, you'll understand why commentators have read the book of Judges as a book of the Israelites' moral decline and degradation, in which Yiftach and Samson are on the low end, but not yet the lowest, the low end of the curve. Okay? It gets even worse with these last two stories. Okay? So those who see the book of Judges as chronicling moral and religious decline in the people and therefore in the leadership, see the next book, these last two stories as continuing that plummeting, and they see the next book, the book of Samuel, as a story of moral ascent under Eli the priest and Samuel the prophet, who's going to be the last of the judges, and then under King Saul and King David and King Solomon. Okay, so descent with the judges until the worst of the worst with the concubine at the outrage at Giv'ah, and then ascent under Eli, Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. Now, when you read these two weird stories at the end of Judges, Micah's statue and the outrage at Giv'ah, you'll repeatedly come across the phrase, there was no king in those days, or there was no king in Israel in those days. No, there was no king in those days, and each person did as he pleaseth. Okay. Now this is a clear setup for the next book, for Samuel, in which the Israelites form a monarchy. Okay, a united kingdom for the 12 tribes. Okay, so repeatedly in these last two stories you'll hear, in those days there was no king and each person did it as he pleaseth. Okay, and the central storyline in the next book is about how there is a king. They form a monarchy and get a king. Now, given the horrific content of these two last stories in Judges, and given the conventional view of the book of Judges as chronicling moral and religious decline, again from a good leader like Ehud, like Joshua and Ehud, to okay leaders like Barak and Gideon, to bad leaders like Avimelech, Iftach, and Samson, to the truly horrifying last two stories, this line of analysis is understandable. Okay, and in this context, this repeating phrase of there was no in those days there was no king, and each person did as he pleaseth. This repeating phrase is understood as a critique of the state of the nation at the end of the book of Judges. Okay, it's seen as a criticism by the biblical author of Judges about the degraded state of the nation at the end of Judges. And therefore, when we start reading Samuel, we can understand why the people were requesting a king in the very next book. Okay? Because, this situation of no king in those days, and each person did as he pleaseth, is painting a very negative picture for us of what life is like with no king. However, if it's true that there was no king in those days and each person did as he pleaseth is indeed a criticism which identifies monarchy as the proper and good solution to this bad state of affairs, then why were Samuel and God so opposed to monarchy? As you'll read in those chapters in Samuel 1 through 8. Samuel and God clearly did not see monarchy as a step up from judgeship. Okay. Samuel will, who speaks for God, the book clarifies that Samuel is not speaking on his own, he's speaking for God. Samuel will offer a blistering rebuke in these chapters that you'll read, 1 through 8, actually, specifically in 8. Samuel in God's name will offer a blistering rebuke of monarchy as a form of political tyranny, and also as a religious affront to God. So, if monarchy is tyranny, as Samuel warns the Israelites, and the book of Kings later confirms, does this mean that we're actually misconstruing the book of Judges? Okay. Can it be that no king in those there was no king in those days, and each person did as he pleaseth, is actually a good thing? Maybe that's a description of the good old days, before we had kings. And if so, can it be that the book of Judges is not a book chronicling moral decline? Maybe Samson was not the worst judge, but the best judge. We'll see next time.